Chapter 21 is where we're at. And so we'll be looking at what I've called it. So I've figured what would be best. We'd go 3 weeks on the scheduled, I think, 10 chapters. So we'll try to go 3 this morning and 3 next week and then 4 on that final week. But this one I entitled Decisions in Desperation. We'll see as we go through why that's so. So just a rehearsal of where we're at as far as the history. So Saul's carnality showed itself in suspicion, jealousy, fear, and rage, and which opened him to demonic influence, or demon influence, I put. So just be aware of all that. That, by the way, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but it goes right with the message of this morning, where I'm at in Ephesians about giving place to the devil. And that's what really Saul did when he got stuck on his suspicion and bitterness and all that kind of stuff. Just really has opened the door for some terrible things. So both David and Jonathan recognized his trouble, but remember at the first they just, they sort of overlooked it. They kept ministering to him. Even when David had a spear chucked at him, he said, okay, well, King Saul's going through a tough time right now. And so it seems like he always gave him grace and just continued on, and same with his son. But then at the end, I just put, let me see, but seemed to always think best of him, but remained as true to King Saul as possible. And we saw how David always behaved himself wisely and how he did what the king told him to do. And so that was just his response to God in the midst of a troubling time. Then came the time that Saul chased David to Ramah, and David realized that Saul's purpose was to kill him. And then soon after, remember that's where Jonathan and David arranged, where David would hide out, and Jonathan would test his dad at the new moon feast, where David should have been there. And I think that's where Jonathan gets angry at his father and realizes, whoa, he is out to kill David. And so both of them, over a short period of time, seemed to come to the full realization that that was Saul's purpose, was to kill David. So in a tearful meeting at the end of chapter 20, there, David and Jonathan, they renew their covenant of friendship. Jonathan goes home, and David goes on the run. Okay, and so that's where we ended. So think about it just a moment. David is now a fugitive. He's literally running for his life from the law law in the personification as King Saul, running from the law that is out to kill him. And so that's really what you have to, so that's why I've called it Decisions in Desperation. So let's jump in here of chapter 21, and let's do this. Let's read 1 through 9. And let's do something a little different here. Let's just read around, and if you'd rather not read, just say pass, and we'll go to the next person. So let's just start here, and I'll go to Don. So I'll begin. Chapter 21, verse 1. Then came David to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, Why art thou alone, and no man with thee?
David said unto Ahimelech the priest, The king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, Let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee. And I have appointed my servants to such and such a place. Now therefore, it is under thine hand, give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, or what there is present.
You read 2, but that's... No, well, no, just 1. I think we'll be fine.
And the priest answered David and said, There is no common bread under mine head, but there is hallowed bread, which the young men have kept themselves at least from winter. And David answered the priest and said unto him, Of the truth, women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy. And the bread is in the matter common, yea, though we were sanctified this day in the vessel.
Would you like to read, Haley? We're 21, verse 6. Okay, Zach? Okay, Brother Cranky?
And David said unto Ahimelech, and is there not a fear under thine hand spear or sword? For I have neither brought my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste.
And the priest said, the sword of Goliath and the Philistines, whom thou slewest in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If thou wilt take it, there is no other save that here. And David said, there is none like that. Give it to me.
Okay, good. And so let's just jump in here. So where David heads initially, he gives some, I say, seeking assistance at Nob. So David traveled to Nob to see Ahimelech, the priest, there in verse number 1. So just a map so we see where things are at. So Gibeah of Saul, that's where King Saul was sort of his headquarters. And so he goes to Nob where the priest, it does seem, because there's showbread there, it does seem as though, because the tabernacle was at Shiloh, and there's some statements there, it still seems to be there, but maybe they set up, I don't know. It's hard to discern, but it would seem the tabernacle had been moved to Nob, at least the city of priests. And so that, I couldn't find a definitive statement there. But what I want you to see, there's something interesting later on in chapter 22 and verse 10, and we'll just read that verse. And we know there's something mentioned there that's not mentioned in this first narrative. It says, and he, that's speaking of Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for David and gave him victuals or bread and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So I think that's probably in the order of priority, in the order of events. So what was the first thing David went to see Ahimelech at Nob for, based on verse number 10 of chapter 22? No. That's what the narrative tells us. There's something left out of this narrative, that 22:10 that I just read. What's the first thing David went there for? Yeah, I think that's why he went to the city of the priests. He wanted to find some leadership from God. Now, he also got bread, and he also got the sword of Goliath, but there was something else there, and that's mentioned several times in the narrative to follow, that David went there to inquire of the Lord. And I think that was his, though he's fleeing for his life, but think about it. He's fleeing for his life, but as he's doing so, the mind, if a heart's after God, what is he looking for? The Lord's leadership. And so as he makes that decision, I think that's a primary reason why he went there. What stirred Ahimelech's, back to chapter 21, what stirred Ahimelech's fear right when David arrived? Yeah, by himself. Why do you think that concerned Ahimelech? Yeah, I would. So what was David's relationship with Saul, family-wise? Son-in-law. And so I would think he probably had some kind of guard normally with him. Also, he was a military leader, so for him to be by himself would be an odd thing. And that, I think that tells us as well, and from some of the things that Ahimelech will say later, it sounds like this was common for David to come by and see Ahimelech when he went out to some kind of military campaign, because Ahimelech says, well, it's not new that I'm seeking God's leadership for David. That was not new for him. And so I think all of that, so he's by himself, he's saying, whoa, what's going on here? You don't have anybody with you. So how does David respond? Does he disclose everything that's going on? Yes or no? Right. Was that, did King Saul send him out on a covert operation? No, okay. So the interesting thing is, I was reading through that, David, I put he wasn't fully truthful. Let me ask you a question here, because here's the interesting. The Spirit of God never says, and David sinned right here. It never talks about that. and when Jesus brings up this event. He doesn't say in David's sinfulness. It doesn't say any of that. And so I don't know if everything is revealed to us and David's motivation and all this. Let me ask you a question. And why would it be helpful if Ahimelech was kept in the dark? It doesn't turn out this way, but what may have been David's reasoning to keep Ahimelech in the dark? Well, so he would not, and Saul to know where he's at. Number one, another thing, that there was another priest that helped. That would have been, I can't remember how, maybe a cousin or a brother, I can't remember, to Ahimelech. Ahitub, who was, I think was his dad, and his son went out with the ark to King Saul when he was out in the battle. Earlier, we saw that in earlier chapters. There's another reason I'm thinking about. It had to do with King Saul. Yes, sir.
I'm thinking that Saul might kill him because of what he might know.
Right, and so maybe keeping Ahimelech in the dark would be beneficial for Ahimelech later on, because then Ahimelech could say, well, David lied to me. He said this. And so we'll see that, because that does come up a little bit later. So I don't know why all of that, but that's David was not completely honest. He wasn't forthwith. He didn't disclose everything. Hey, King Saul's out to kill me. Let me say this too. If he doesn't know that, now it is becoming more public in the private realm of Saul. Remember, first of all, he was saying, hey, I'll let the Philistines kill him. Hey, this will happen. Maybe God will take his life. And then he started to disclose it. Hey, I want David dead. But that wasn't national yet. That wasn't known everywhere. And so maybe saying King Saul's out to kill me, I'm innocent. But so all of a sudden that would deteriorate his opinion of the king. And maybe that was part of David's motive as well. And so there's a lot of interesting things here that could motivate, and the Lord doesn't tell us all of that here. So let me go on. What it does tell is God provided for him. So Ahimelech only had sacred showbread, verse 6 there, which was for the priests only, but Ahimelech is willing to give it if David's men were ceremonially clean. And so he does do that. And let me just jump down to verse number 7. Who was there, and how was he related to Saul? So verse 7. Who was there when David was at Nob? Doeg. And what country was he from? He was an Edomite. And how was he related to Saul? Yeah, so somehow he took care of Saul's cattle and was heading over those who took care of the cattle. Later on, he's called a chief of the servants of Saul, I think, in the next chapter. So he was somewhere up in rank as far as Saul's cabinet or Saul's leadership and who he appointed over what. So what else did David receive from Ahimelech that we already noticed, but just the sword of Goliath. And, David said, there's none like it. I'll take it. I'll continue on that. So just a thought about this. And let's go over to Mark chapter 2 a moment. But what lesson did Jesus teach about this incident? So let's go over to Mark chapter 2. And you probably know it already, but just remember how Scripture intertwines with Scripture. And so Mark chapter 2, verse 23. And I'll just read this down through here, but I'll still ask you the question, what lesson did Jesus teach from this incident? And it came to pass that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began, as they went, to pluck the ears of corn. And so remember, the corn there is not like we have today of corn on a husk. You're talking about corn, Old English just meant grain. Okay, so the grain field, whether it was wheat or barley, that was a general term long ago. Verse 24, and the Pharisees said unto him, behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And Jesus said unto them, have ye not read what David did when he had need and was a hungered, he and they that were with him? And remember, with him, he told Ahimelech, I've got some men, I forget how he says, they're not here, but they're somewhere else. And that apparently that was true, because Jesus mentions that here. 26, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful to eat, but for the priests, and gave also to them which were with him. And he said unto them, Jesus said to the crowd there, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. So what's Jesus' point? What's he trying to get across to the Pharisees? Obviously, it has something to do with the incident of 23, eating the grain on, as they would, the Pharisees would say, hey, they were working, because they would get the grain and they would rub it in their hands and then they would eat it. So what's Jesus' point? Yes?
Verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. That tells me that the Sabbath was made to be obeyed by man, but man's basic needs should be met.
Right. There's an aspect there that the Sabbath was made for the benefit of humanity. And part of the concept there up in 24 or 25 and 26, where he said, hey, the need of David and his men overruled this ceremonial aspect of the law, because there was a human need that needed to be met. And so I just put it down that way. Human needs are in desperation when there's emergency. They overrule ceremonial regulations. And so Jesus said, hey, there's a priority. My men were hungry, and really it was part of their law, misinterpreting God's law, but he said, hey, there's something more important than just following these rules and regulations of a ceremonial type. It's the need of humanity. That's why if you were about ready to come to church, and that's the right thing to do on a Sunday, and your neighbor all of a sudden, the wife comes over and say, John, he's grabbing his chest and he's really hurting. Could you help? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm heading to church. God said, no. You have something all of a sudden became a priority in your life at that moment in time. Do what you can, because there's an emergency here. That overrules your attendance with God's people at that moment in time. And so there's an aspect of that Jesus brings out. Okay, so let's head back to 1 Samuel chapter 21. And we'll continue on here. So then anxiety in Gath. So David fled to Gath to escape Saul, as it says. In fact, let's read these next 5 verses here. Someone like to read all 5 of those 4, I guess it's really 6, from 10 to 15. Okay, let me go down. I saw him first. Just jump right in there.
And David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul, and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said unto him, Is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing one another of him in dances, saying, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? And David laid up these words in his heart, and was sore afraid of Achish the king of Gath. And he changed his behavior before them, and feigned himself mad in their hands, and scrabbled on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. Then said Achish unto his servants, Lo, ye see this man is mad, therefore then have ye brought him to me? Have I need of madmen, that ye have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?
Okay. And then it says the next. So this, just so you see where we're at here. So he flees the Nob, and then he was there. He's got some things, and apparently with some of his, maybe there was some people who were his personal servants at the palace who came with him, though they didn't come to Nob with him directly. But now he flees to Gath. So remember, this is in the Philistine territory. There as he heads there. So who do we know? Who else do we know is from Gath that we've seen in our narrative? Goliath, okay, Goliath of Gath. Why do you think David, again, decisions, the outline here that I have, decisions in desperation. So I think it was probably not the wisest, but what may have been reasoning through the mind of David to flee back to Gath? Who is he fleeing from? Saul, who would probably not pursue him in a Philistine city. Yeah, so I think that was maybe part of his reasoning. You would think, okay, here is that guy who slew our champion, and maybe he didn't fully, I would think he would know that, and maybe he's thinking, oh, wow, what a better soldier to have under my command than a guy that's better than our champion, defeated our champion. So maybe he was thinking, hey, I can take a defector in. I'm not sure if those were in the mind of David. It doesn't tell us altogether, but yeah, so he flees. Like I said, I don't think it was the wisest choice, but some thoughts here. How was David's reception there? In verse number 11. What did the servants of Achish think? Yeah. And it does, from what's stated in verse 14 and 15, it does seem as though David had initially been brought into the king's presence. And maybe there was, and I don't think it would have been very long, but I think there was a short time that he was there and he talked to the king and everything seemed to be fine, at least for a short time, as he was going through this. But now David's fears become more intense. So now he's got Israel after him, and now he's got these servants. And I'll show you something in just a moment. It seems as though they had after a time had taken him in, and there was some forcefulness about how they were dealing with him. But now he's got two nations. So he writes about this in Psalm 56. So let's jump over there to Psalm 56, and we'll come back a little bit. So Psalm 56, we'll just jump over there. But I don't know if we're going to have time to go through all of this, but notice the inspired title that's before verse 1 of Psalm 56. To the chief musician, unto Jonathan, Elam Rokim, Miktam of David, when the Philistines took him in Gath. So reading verse 1 and 2, there's a repeated phrase. How is David viewing his problems, in a sense, at this time? In verses 1 and 2. Yeah, they're going to swallow me up. That's my enemies are going to swallow me up. And so he's praying to the Lord there. I think that's what I asked here. Yeah, next question. After that, what is David's response to fearful times in verse 3 and 4? Again, there's a repeated phrase in verse 3 and 4. Yeah, I'm going to trust in the Lord. I love that. I think many of us know verse 3, what time I am afraid, I will trust in thee. And so remember, I don't know if any of us are fleeing as a fugitive. Our home country is against us. Now we go to a foreign country and they're against me. There's some real concerns there. But he says, when I'm afraid, I'm going to keep my faith and trust in God. So verse 5 through 7, he's probably looking back at Saul and what happened back there. Verse 5, every day they wrest my words. Wrestle, that's the idea of wrestle my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They gather themselves together. They hide themselves. They mark my steps. Remember back where it said Saul from that day forward kept his eye on David. So they're marking my steps. They wait for my soul. Shall I escape by iniquity? In thine anger cast down the people, O God. So he just say, man, they're twisting. They're watching out for me. Everything, and that could be true as far as in Gath as well. So what's David's assurance in verses 8 and 9? Yeah, God's for him. And probably verses 8, when it says thou, he's speaking to God. Lord, you see where I'm going. You know all of my tears. I think elsewhere, yeah, it's in this one. Put thou my tears in thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? Lord, you're writing it all down. You know it very clearly. My enemies are everywhere, but I know that God is for me. Wow. And, just thinking of the desperation he was in. I mean, it was pretty intense as we think about all of this. And then verses 10 and 11 is really the refrain from verse 4. Let me just read verse 4. And again, it's in 10 and 11. In God I will put my in God I will praise his word. In God I will put my trust. I will not fear what flesh can do unto me. And then 10 and 11, in God will I praise his word. In the Lord will I praise his word. In God will I put my trust. I will not be afraid what man can do unto me. And then verse 12 is interesting. Thy vows are upon me, O God. I will render praises unto thee. So whose vows does he speak of there? Yeah, God's. I was just saying, wow, that's really interesting. So just to let you know, when you're studying, I looked up. I have probably 10 different commentaries on Psalms, and so I'm looking them up. And they all, it seemed like every one of them except one said, thy vows speaks of David's vows unto God. And I thought, well, that's really not what it says. Whether you're looking in Hebrew or English or in whatever translation, I was saying, man, what? And so let me ask you this. Thinking of the 1 Samuel, going through this, how did God vow to David? Because he said, thy vows are upon me, O God. I will render praise unto thee, for those vows. Yeah, he'd been anointed king. And so David, while he's going through this, and all of a sudden he realizes this trip to Gath, and now I'm in the city with Achish the king, and now his servants are saying, David is not the right guy, king. You probably shouldn't have him here. And he's saying, God, your vows are upon me. I'm trusting your promise. See, that's what I think when he says, in God will I put my trust. I will praise his word. His word was his vow. I've been anointed. I'm supposed to be king. Folks, when you go through desperate times, you need to get to a place when you say, man, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to turn. You need to go back to the word in prayer and say, God, your word says this. And that's what you hold on to in desperation. Yes, sir. The vow, in a sense, yeah. So I think it's the same thing, a vow, a promise. Amen. Yeah, so yes, so it'd be the promise, and then, verse 13, thou hast delivered my soul from death. Wilt thou not deliver my feet from falling, that I may walk before thee in the light of the living? So I think all of that. It doesn't seem as though 56, that he's been delivered yet. Okay, so he's I don't know if there was time where he was, at night, he just kept up and God put upon his heart and he's writing about this. He's writing out his prayers, just thinking about all of this, meditating on it. I said the whose vows. So then back in our text, hold your place in the Psalms because I'll come right back here. But what did he do? I think most of us know, but what did he do? What were the results of, I'll just put, what did he do next in verse 13? Yeah, he changed his behavior, so he's acting as a madman. So he's scribbling on the walls. I don't know what he's writing, and he's drooling. Every time if anybody saw him, part of his breakfast was on his beard, and he's a mess. He doesn't change his clothes. He's crazy. What is wrong? He's lost something, in his head. Now, he writes about this in 34. So jump back to Psalm 34. In fact, what was interesting, I didn't go into there are several others that speak about this time in his life, but notice Psalm 34, and we'll not read the whole thing here, but I do want to, highlight here. So Psalm 34, the title there, the inspired title, a Psalm of David, when he changed his behavior before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed. So this, 56 seems to be why he's still in Gath. 34 seems to be shortly after his release. And so there's a couple questions here with that. Though not mentioned in 1 Samuel 21, what was David doing during this crisis? And really Psalm 56 already tells us, but there's an emphasis here in verse 4 and verse 6. What was David doing? So Psalm 34, verse 4, verse 6. Yeah, he's asking for the Lord for help. So I personally believe that God gave him the idea. David, act like an idiot. Act like a crazy man. Act like you've lost your head. That's why you're here. Because who would have come to Gath? And maybe he rebuked David a little bit, doesn't tell us that. But I think his actions here were not just him reasoning through a way I can get out of this. He was in God's presence this whole, and God, I think, put it in his heart. As it says there, he heard me and he delivered me out of all my fears. It doesn't say, he gave me this plan. So this poor man cried and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. And then there's some other things just to remember when you're going through a crisis in a time of desperation. Notice verse number 7. The angel of the Lord encampeth around about them that fear him and delivereth him. So David gave all the praise to God. Verse number 15, and there's others in here, but just some highlights. The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. So remember, God's not far. He sees you. He hears you. Verse 18, 18 and 19. The Lord is nigh. He's near unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as of our contrite spirit. So that tells us David realized, I can't get out of this. God, help me. And he was broken. There was, let me go on. In verse 19, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth them out of them all. And so he just knew God's protection and grace. And then verse 22, I just put what was the lesson he wanted everyone to know. And so verse 22, the last one, the Lord redeemeth the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. We need to understand, though David was a king, and sometimes we forget, before he ever became king, he's literally running for his life. I mean, running for his life. There's only, as he said to Jonathan at one time, there's just a step between me and death. If I stop, I'm dying. They're going to take me out. So all of this, I came to this. So a man after God's own heart, yet he was accused of being very evil. He was anointed to be king, yet he's hiding in the wilderness. He's praised as a national hero, yet now he's running as a fugitive. And so why? It was to learn more about his God. It was to build his relationship with God. It was to grow his trust in God, because that is the kind of king that God needed. That was the kind of king that Deuteronomy 17 says, if you ever have a king, here is what he needs to be like. He needs to be in the Word. He needs to be trusting me. He needs to be humble. He needs to be, and there was some key characteristics of a king. And even David wouldn't qualify, wouldn't be even on those unless he went through what he did. And sometimes people we want positions, but we fail to realize in God's kingdom, you've got to go through this before you're ever elevated, even in this life. And so more just trying to picture some of that stuff, and I didn't go. I was going to look for some of these places in Israel and what it was like, where he was at, but there's a lot of wilderness that he was running for his life, and so just amazing. So any comments or other thoughts here about that up to this point? And what was interesting is in the Psalms, as I started reading, there's a bunch right there in the 50s where it talks about these episodes in 1 Samuel. And so, again, God was using him to express, the Spirit of God was using him to write these truths for us. Okay, so just a little thought there, learning to trust God in the difficult times. And so we have Saul on the one side, he's running after David, and he's running from God in a sense. And then David, he's running from Saul to God. And so from this part, we see that David's thinking of God's character. I would probably phrase it a little bit differently, but I didn't have time to change the wording already on the material there. I would say he's learning to trust God, but knowing God's character through all of this. So just a thought here. So all of chapter 21, it seems that David made some unwise choices in his desperation, but God remained faithful. God was good to provide the bread, to protect him, and this Gath to guide him, even giving him plans and purposes, because in it all, David kept looking to the Lord. And that's really the key in crisis, key in desperation. Don't stop looking to the Lord. Don't start trusting in yourself and your wisdom. Okay, any other thoughts, comments up to there? Okay, let's jump in the tragedy at Nob. So David flees to the cave in Adullam, his family and his relatives join him. I'm not going to read that right now for time's sake. And then 400 men make him their leader. I do want you to see something, though. I thought it's interesting. In verse number 2, and no, I'm in the wrong chapter. Chapter 22, verse 2. And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontent gathered themselves unto David, and he became the captain over them, and there was about 400 of them. I think that's, so Adullam, again, he's traveling from Gath. He gets away, travels to the cave in Adullam. That's in verse number 1. And says his family comes there, and now all these other people. That doesn't sound like the best crowd to come, but I think that's in relationship to King Saul and what was happening there. And so they maybe have heard of David and knew of David, and so they're coming to him, and this becomes his group that he leads, and they become a well-armed militia, I guess you could say, well-trained by David. Sorry. Oh, I know what that was. Sorry, I have some little arrows, are a little bit hard to see. So yeah, it's joined by his family and 400 men. So his family come from Jabez. They're up around Bethlehem, just south of Jerusalem, which is Jabez at this time. So right in that area. So his family comes, and then people all over come to be with him there in the cave of Adullam. So this is interesting. Verse 3 and 4, he takes his parents to Moab. And so let me ask you a question. Thinking of Moab, what connections does David and his family have with Moab? Why would David take his parents there? Yes. Yeah, Ruth. So Ruth would be his great-grandmother. Okay, so grandmother to Jesse, his dad. And so remember, that was part of that. So that probably seems, but notice how far this is. So from Adullam all the way down to Moab. Moab's over on the other side of the Dead Sea, and so Mizpah is way down here. And I didn't get a distance, but I think it's over 100. Someone said in the 80s, so somewhere along that, depending on the route, the roads that they took. So yeah, so Ruth. So it's interesting. You never know how God's setting things up for days ahead. So it just, all of that's interesting. We don't know. The Bible doesn't say for sure, but there was a family connection. So David returns, ends up in the forest of Hareth. Who did God lead to side with David at this time? There in verse number 5. Somebody's well known later on through the rest of 1st and then 2nd Samuel. No, not yet. Yeah, Joab. No, not Joab. Someone else is mentioned in verse 5, chapter 22. Yeah, Gad, the prophet. Okay, he was with David all the way, really, till the end of his life. He did side with his Adonijah instead of Solomon, but he was with David through all of his difficulties, and so God had already led him. So he heads back from dropping off his parents, heads back to there in the forest of Hareth. And trying to look that up a little bit, there's no certainty about the location, but so I don't have a problem just finding a location for right now. But David and his men camp here by Gad's direction. Gad said, "Hey, don't stay in the stronghold." And so maybe there was another place down here somewhere, but Gad said, "Don't stay there. Go back up to Judah." And so he does. He heads back up there to the forest, and we're still continuing with the tragedy at Nob. So King Saul found David's location, gives a speech to his leaders from the tribe of Benjamin, and I really want you to see this. Let's read 7 through, I think it's through 9, maybe it's just 7 and 8. Let's read 7 and, let's read 6, 7, and 8. Someone like to read 6, 7, and 8 for us? Okay, Rick? Let me stop there a moment. So apparently he doesn't have everybody around him, but he's in Gibeon, which is in the tribe of the Benjamin, that area. So he seems to be. What tribe was Saul from? Benjamin. Yeah, Benjamin. Okay, so just think about that a little bit. Okay, continue on. So in verse 7, the question there, what does Saul appeal? It should say, how does Saul appeal to them for their loyalty? What does he say to them? Yeah, I think that's probably already been done. But he says, hey, is the son of Jesse, who's he referring to, the son of Jesse? David. Okay, is David going to give you these positions? Is David going to give you these benefits? You know, look what I have done for you. You owe me. You know, I think that's pretty much what he's getting across. And then what attitudes can you see in Saul's words in verse 8? There's a number of things there, but just read it again. What comes to your mind when you read those words? I'm sorry?
He feels conspired against.
Okay, he feels, woe is me. Everyone's against me. Well, you're the king. I know, but everyone's against me. Woe is me. What's another one? Anybody see anything else in that? He does mention me quite a bit, and none of you. Yeah, he says that Jonathan is in league with David. Is that true? No, not against him. I mean, they are friends, but yeah. So to me, it's here is what happens when bitterness and anger start to just to influence your life and create that. You start thinking of things that are not true, but to you they're as real as this pulpit. They're as blue as the sky. They're as white as the clouds. They're as bright as the sun. I mean, can't everybody see this? That's what he's saying. Hey, I gave you all of this stuff. I benefited. So you guys need to be faithful, loyal to me. And by the way, how come none of you? That's not true. He had people that were loyal to him. But how come none of you told me my son is disloyal to me and he's siding with David who wants to kill me? Was that true? No. Saul wanted to kill, but I'm just saying that when you start allowing bitterness and anger to become part of the grain, you cannot see very well. It's like having glasses that get a little bit of spray paint and so everything is blurry. I think it's that way, but I'm not. Is that so-and-so? Wait, I just can't see it. I don't understand. Doesn't anybody care for me? Doesn't anybody know what's happening? That's a whole, I mean, we could go into a lot of study with all of that, but I think it's very, very interesting. So any questions, comments on that besides that? Wow, it's amazing. But be careful when I say it's amazing, just be aware that you have this, you're of like flesh like Saul. And so we have to be careful. I just said, what did Doeg say that Ahimelech did for David? And we talked about that again. He sought out God for him. He gave him the bread, and he gave him the sword of Goliath. So Saul calls him, I say him, I meant Ahimelech. I don't even have, called him Ahimelech to him, and the other priests to Gibeah. So from where David was at in Nob, he calls all these priests and falsely accuses Ahimelech of conspiracy with David against him. He defends himself to no avail. This is, I think, one of the saddest. So let's just read part of that. So he calls him there. Notice verse 13, the accusations that Ahimelech makes. Why have you conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, in that thou hast given him bread and a sword and inquired of God for him? It's interesting. What was Saul not able to do? To get answers from God. And so his jealousy was over David's godliness, and I think in a sense with that as well. That he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is this day? Was that what David was doing? Was he lying in wait to kill Saul? No, not even close. Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, and who is so faithful among all thy servants? I think this was the Spirit of God filling Ahimelech's mouth to confront Saul about his delusions. And again, he wasn't delusional as a madman as David portrayed himself to be. It wasn't that way. It was just he wasn't seeing reality as it truly was. Who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is also the king's son-in-law? He's in your family. And he goeth at thy bidding. He does what you said and is honorable in thy house. So again, he's saying all of these characteristics of David. He's trying to help King Saul see the reality that he can't see. And then verse number 15, did I then begin to inquire of God for him? So I mentioned that the implication is I've done this many, many times. It's not like, oh, I'll do this for him still. No, I've always done that. Be it far from me, let not the king impute. Don't let him put to my account anything to his servant or to all the house of my father, for thy servant kneweth nothing of all this, less or more. And the king said, thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house. So what happens after that? King Saul says to his servants, go kill the priests that we've brought here, kill them. They said, we're not going to do that. So, man, I thought, well, the servants to defy the king, knowing his not always seeing things well, that was, but they said, we're not going to lift our hands against the priests. Those are God's priests. So we asked Doeg, who happened to be there, said, Doeg, take him out, and he did. And he killed 85 priests right there on the spot. And then after that, verse number 19 says he went to Nob, and notice what it says, and the city of the priests, and he smote it with the edge of the sword, both men and women and children and sucklings and oxen and asses and sheep with the edge of the sword. That's just thinking of what he did. I put how many, that was 85 there. So he traveled to Nob and he killed everybody there. And I think there's a purposeful, under the Spirit of God, compare that to what Saul did to the Amalekites, or was supposed to. He goes to the enemies of God, and God says, I want you to go take out the Amalekites. And he spares some of the best of the flock and the sheep and so forth. And here, these are God's people, and he wipes out them and their whole town. And I go, wow, how could, it's just, wow. It's, so at that time, Ahimelech's son, Abiathar, he escapes the slaughter, flees to David to tell him what happened. And it really, let's just close here, 22 and 23. So Abiathar comes and he tells that Saul has slain the Lord's priests in verse 21 to 22. And David said to Abiathar, I know it that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, remember when David first visited, that he would surely tell Saul. And he said, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. So this was it, because I was wondering, is David saying, it was my fault? And the word occasion there is in it. It's not a direct cause, but it's like the beginning of a series of events that led to a tragic day. In other words, David said, oh, man, I knew it. Maybe something in your heart. You ever done that? And after the past, oh, man, I knew it. I should have done. And I think that's what David was saying. He's not saying necessarily the Lord didn't lead him or guide him. That's not. He just said, oh, man, I knew it. And I have occasion. From what I did and from what happened, not necessarily but include what he did. He wasn't saying, hey, I directly caused the death, but he's saying, hey, that was the start of a series of events that I'm responsible for. And so he wasn't saying, Abiathar, I killed your dad. That's not what he said. But he said, I did start a series of events. And so I think he's looking back with some regret. I don't know for sure, but just that word occasion does not mean I directly caused the death of your dad. So then he continues on in verse number 23, abide with me, fear not, for he that seeketh thy life, or my life, seeketh thy life, but with me thou shalt be in safeguard. And so David said, I'll protect you, I'll watch over you. So we need to stop there. I guess that was all I was going to mention here. We'll just stop there. Any thoughts, comments, questions before we go? Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you for the truth of your word, and